So let's look at the data. Figure 26 shows two potential measures or two dimensions of legal complexity. On the y-axis, we show a banking regulation similarity index. And this is an index that I and co-authors actually computed using a World Bank data set of banking and financial regulation across the world. The data set itself has over 800 indicators or legal provisions, and they simply quantify the extent to which legal provisions exist or don't exist, or how binding they are, in case there's a structure of a regulator that can be scored from 1 to 4. They simply look at differences in regulatory structure and assign them numerical values. And what we do in our index is we take those 800 plus numbers and we crunch them into one number using a fancy technique called clustering and multidimensional scaling. I won't go into the econometrics of multidimensional scaling here, but all you have to know to understand this graph is that, well, we can assign different countries' financial law, we can assign them a score based on how similar that country's complexity is. So very complicated financial laws will get similar scores, very high scores on our measure, whereas in very simple financial laws we'll get very low scores. Now, in order to make sure that we weren't just hallucinating and making this up, we compared this with another legal complexity score that we got from an international federation of company secretaries and company and corporation companies. And it's called TMF. And what we find is we find some correlation between the legal complexity that they find when they go through provision by provision of financial law in various jurisdictions. However, there are some differences. So the way that we kind of resolve this problem in the paper is that we say, well, our measure is more a measure of similarity, whereas in their measure might be considered a measure more of this actual complexity. But because they're completely non-transparent about the way they develop the index or show how the index works over time, of course we prefer our own measure. But in any case, stepping back and looking at the figure, we show that there are levels of legal complexity. Even if you don't believe any one particular measure, just taking a combination of the two measures, you can see how different countries very clearly have different levels of legal complexity. So we see the US, Germany, UK having relatively high levels of legal complexity on both measures, whereas in countries like China might have very high similarity with very complicated legal systems on the one dimension, but relatively uncomplicated financial law on the other dimension. However, the moral of the graph still holds that countries can be ranked according to their financial law, and we can use differences in the complexity or the extent of that financial law in order to see how it impacts on advisors' competitiveness. Turning our attention to the other figure, we show the degree of differentiation in advisory relationships during the period. So what this graph does is it says, okay, we're going to look at each advisor. We're going to take all kinds of competitive attributes, their market size, the types of sectors they focused on, the types of clients they focused on, the countries that they worked in, and so forth. We're going to take that whole array of data, that whole matrix of data, and again, we're going to just squash it into two factors. And so in that way, we reduce all this crazy complexity into two very simple factors, which we label as strategic factor Y and strategic factor X. And so that we don't get into this crazy debate about whether strategic factor X actually represents some label that we give it, like, for example, orientation to customer needs. We just don't label these factors. We say, look, there is some dimension of competitiveness that these advisors are working on. The data show that to us. That part cannot be argued. Now, we don't know what it is, and we're not going to even try and explain it. All you have to do is take this fact rather than an interpretation and say, look, the fact exists that these different advisors have chosen these two dimensions upon which to compete. And using the econometric analysis that we engaged in for this study, we see that different advisors clearly pursued different types of bundles of strategies as they went for Chinese M&A mandates. And we don't label the companies here, partly so that we're not very controversial. You'll actually see that labeling in the paper. Now, stepping back and thinking, okay, well, all this data is nice, but what's your theory? What's your view? I mean, what story are you telling about the way legal complexity and differentiation work in order to help Chinese companies get deals done and to help advisors get mandates? And so, of course, following the traditional economic method of analysis, we look at two sides of the market. On the figure 32, we show the utility curves of these Chinese companies. And we say, okay, we see in the data that Chinese companies exhibit preferences for advisors using particular types of legal complexity in order to get deals done and different types of differentiation. And so, of course, we can draw what are known as indifference curves, or we can look at levels of mandates given to different types of companies that are using combinations of these two factors. And on the demand side for advisory service, we can see some kind of demand which is drawn out by these utility curves. And I won't go too much into it because it's microeconomics 101, but for those of you without an economics background, the moral of that part of the story is that Chinese companies are looking for advisors with some combination of access to cool financial law and a differentiation to meet their needs. Now let's look at the supply side of the market, and we can model this as typical production function, if you will, across advisors. Right? Advisors themselves decide to some extent, well, how much legal complexity can we encourage our parliament to give us, or how much legal complexity can we use simply by virtue of locating in a particular jurisdiction? How much money can we spend in order to improve law schools, in order to change legal complexity, and so forth? All you have to do is accept that different advisors have access to different levels of legal complexity for the purposes of this argument. Now, advisors, of course, can make a trade-off. They can rely either on this legal complexity to win Chinese mandates, or they can say, look, we're not going to do that. We're going to focus on differentiating our service offering. And we see that whereas in New York has gone on one side of the scale to focus on the complexity of its law, Switzerland, for its part, has decided to focus on differentiation in order to score these Chinese customers. And all you have to really buy for this side of the argument is that advisors are constantly trying to use proportions of legal complexity and differentiation, or trying to heap up both of these factors in order to compete more effectively. So larger advisors might be closer to the frontier, if you will. Larger advisors might heap up large amounts of differentiation, large amounts of the use of complicated financial law, whereas in smaller advisors might be located inside this production possibilities frontier without this type of heaping. And similarly, some types of Chinese companies might require very high extensive heaping. A very complicated state-owned enterprise might require relatively large amounts of differentiation and access to complex financial law, whereas in other types of companies just don't need it, so why pay the expense? So the goal is to match at various levels of differentiation and legal complexity, is to match these advisors with companies. And that's the basic model that we use in order to get our paper going. And we use probabilities, which we will describe in the appendix to this paper.